Dr. Aaron Ruck Singer is a historian of the modern Middle East with a research focus on 20th century Islamic movements and states. He received his bachelor's at the University of Pennsylvania, his master's in philosophy at Oxford, and his PhD at Princeton University. In his first book, Practicing Islam in Egypt, Print Media and Islamic Revival, he drew on ideologically diverse Islamic magazines from this period to chart the rise of an Islamic revival in the 1970s, Egypt within a larger global story of religious contestation and change. His second book, which he will be discussing today, is entitled In the Shade of the Sunna, Salafi Piety in the 20th Century Middle East. This study explores Islam's fastest growing movement through a transnational lens with a particular emphasis on Egypt. Moving beyond a focus on specific organization or commitment to the boundaries of particular nation states, it traces the emergence and consolidation of distinctly Salafi social practices between 1926 and present. We will be exploring two examples of these distinctly Salafi practices. And Dr. Ruxinger, thank you for joining us today. I want you to explore how gender segregation is an example of what you term performative demands of modern visions, gender, communal membership, and piety.
All right, thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here. So to get into your question, I should probably begin with how I began approaching Salafism as a project. There's this question that both lay people and scholars have of where Salafism comes from. And the basic claim that you hear is that Salafis follow the authoritative account of the Prophet Muhammad's life, the Sunnah. And Salafis, of course, take this position, but academics often echo it. The question then becomes, what does it mean to follow the Sunnah? Are Salafis really more historically continuous with the golden model of the 7th century than other Muslims, than other Islamic movements? Do they really have a distinct interpretive approach? And this is a story that I'm telling of social practice because Salafism is much more than a theological or legal approach. It's also a social movement. That's part of what gives it its influence. And so a focus on social practice gives us a chance to explore how it develops as a movement and, to put it most simply, how it functions. Now, to get to your specific question about gender segregation and the opposite, the prohibition against ikhtilat al-jinsayn, of mixing of men and women. Before I get to the question of social practice, broader visions of piety, and so forth, we can just begin with a starting point: the anxiety of men and women sharing the same social space. Now, there is certainly a concern with male-female interaction in Islamic history. If we're thinking about the association of the term fitna with female sexuality, we go back to at least the 9th century. But generally, concern with male-female interaction is limited to specific spaces. The mosque, the marketplace, and so forth. And of course, there's also the Quranically based prohibition against men and women being unmarried and marriage eligible men and women being alone together, the prohibition against khalwa. The question, though, becomes how gender segregation, in a comprehensive sense of organizing society along separately gendered spaces, becomes a key principle of Salafism as a social movement. Where this comes from interpretively and how it emerges socially and politically. And on the interpretive front, the basic challenge that Salafis faced is that in the 20th century Middle East, there were certainly other movements, namely Islamists, talking about the danger of gender mixing, of ikhtilat al-jinsayn. But Islamists had, in some sense, a much lighter burden of textual proof than Salafis do, because the Salafi claim to authenticity is not merely one of continuity with the Quran and Sunnah, but also the ability to cite hadith reports, or Quranic verses, which illustrate why a certain action is necessary, why it's necessary, why it's forbidden, and so forth. And the problem is that the specific idea of men and women interacting as a dangerous matter, this idea of gender mixing, it's a distinctly modern anxiety. It's a modern anxiety that reflects this notion that one can conceive of gender relations not along a pretty narrow metric of let's avoid men and women having particular forms of relation, namely premarital sex, to seeing gender relations as a broader question of a social community that we call society, also a distinctly modern concept. And to be explicit, the linkage here is between what individuals do and the broader fate of society, that there's this concern that individual immorality can corrupt society more broadly. And again, to come back to Islamic history, I'm not saying there's not a concern with the broader public implications of what one might call impious practice, or certainly Salafis would call impious practice. This is a concern of debates over commanding right and forbidding wrong within the Islamic tradition. There's a particular concern with public versus private sin, precisely because of its publicity, of its public nature. But crucially here, when it comes to al-amr bil ma'ruf wal nahy anil munkar, this obligation to command right and forbid wrong, to avoid public sin, the issue with public sin is not that it threatens to corrupt society at large in any comprehensive sense. And it's not an attempt to regulate society at large, but rather it reflects a concern that if people do things that are not permitted in a public fashion, it could lead people to believe that those things are actually permitted. So we get to the 20th century and to Salafis, and they have to make the case for gender segregation. They are in a competition with other Islamic movements. They're in a competition with a secular nationalist state in Egypt and elsewhere, and they have to make the case for gender segregation as a non-negotiable principle. Now, as I noted before, the problem is that gender mixing as a forbidden action isn't something that comes up explicitly in the Hadith corpus. It's also not a term that appears in the Quran. In some sense, the concern with mixing in Islamic history is not one of genders, but rather one of Muslims and non-Muslims. And that's very clearly not what our pre-modern reference points are pointing to. They're clearly not pointing to gender mixing. And so as a result, Salafis have to come up with a textual case for gender mixing. They have to make the case that, like they do with any other practice that they argue for, that this action is forbidden because here are the proof texts from the Quran and the Sunna. They're not in the position of either Islamic movements or, for that matter, madhab scholars, of being able to appeal to either damning the pretexts of sin, said the Zariyat, or to the maqasid al-Sharia, the broader goals of the Sharia, or even to the common good, al-maslaha al-amma. So they have a problem. They need a textual proof. And to foreshadow where I'm going to end up here, Salafis never actually come up with a persuasive textual proof for forbidding gender mixing. The most audacious and ambitious attempt to make an argument relates to the Quranic prohibition to not flaunt, a tabarruj. There's this prohibition, wala tabarrajna, right? Do not flaunt yourself. The problem for Salafis is that up until around the early 1970s, everyone who's discussing this verse, and it's 3034, and it's not a uncommon topic of discussion when it comes to modesty, understands it as relating to individual female modesty. This is an individual matter. It specifically, in discussions of it, the next step is to explain the concern with tabarruj as the woman's chastity and her place in heaven. And it's very clearly focused on individual female practice. But in the mid to late 1970s, a leading Saudi Salafi, Abdulaziz bin Baz, comes up with a novel interpretation of at-tabarruj. He says at-tabarruj, it doesn't refer to individual conduct, it refers to mixing. At-tabarruj ma'anahu al-ikhtilat. And he makes this claim for a couple of years. first in an Egyptian Salafi periodical, then in its Saudi counterpart. And then by the early 1980s, he's essentially dropped this textual claim. And he talks then about a tabarruj, i.e., to his mind, gender mixing being forbidden, instead based on another set of metrics. A set of metrics that are, and legal methods that are much more familiar to both other Islamic movements and also to madhab scholars, namely these extra textual metrics of the broader interests of the Muslim community, the common good, the goals of the Sharia, and so forth. And so this is how the case is made in somewhat shaky fashion textually. And Ibn Baz gets some pushback in the late 70s for claiming an incredibly novel meaning of the prohibition against tabarruj. But gender mixing is nonetheless important for Salafis. It's important for Salafis in Egypt who lack control of state institutions. It's a way of distinguishing themselves programmatically from other Islamic movements, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. It's also a way for Salafis who are a minority within a broader Wahhabi Hanbali majority in Saudi Arabia of fitting in, because Saudi Arabia has begun to institutionalize gender segregation in the 50s and 60s as they develop their state bureaucracy and educational system. And in the Saudi context, the Wahhabi Hanbalis, such as Muhammad bin Ibrahim, have no problem making the case for gender mixing being forbidden because they don't need explicit proof texts from the Quran and Sunnah, whereas Salafis do. And this is part of why this is something of a difficult spot interpretively for Salafi. And so essentially we have two trajectories of the prohibition against gender mixing for Salafism in Saudi Arabia and Egypt. In Saudi Arabia, a Salafi minority working with a broader Wahhabi Hanbali majority is in the position where this allows them to fit in. It allows them to claim a level of influence within state institutions. It allows them to point to something, because insofar as the ulama in Saudi Arabia have some level of control over over social policy, have access to the levers of influence and power, there's this possibility of really implementing a project of gender segregation. And it's a successful project. In Egypt, though, without access to any real power when it comes to policy, setting policy within state institutions, building new institutions, creating a gender segregated transportation, for example, Salafis are in the position where the prohibition against gender mixing and the solution of gender segregation becomes much more of an ideal than a social reality. Because it is a social reality that Salafi men and women, like their counterparts in Egyptian society, go out every day to school and to work. And by and large, the institutions and spaces that they frequent every day are not gender segregated. And so the question is what to do about this. And there are essentially two strategies that Salafi elites use in this context. One is to ignore it, to simply not acknowledge that this is a problem, to preserve the ideal and to even preserve an understanding of the dangers of not abiding by the ideal, but there's not much one can do. The other approach is actually to change how one understands ikhtilat, how one understands the prohibition against gender mixing, what it means to engage in gender segregation. And here, by the early 21st century, Egyptian Salafis are taking the view that there are both forbidden and permitted forms of gender mixing. Now, this creates some, one might say, annoyance among some Saudi Salafis, and rightfully so. And they respond to the effect of, "What are you talking about? There can't be permitted mixing." But the argument that Egyptian Salafis here make is that a woman can, through her individual conduct, segregate herself from the world around her, from the society around her. So she will not lead to immorality in her by virtue of being in those spaces. She is not at risk as long as she conducts herself in a certain way. Now, the critical reader would say, well, that's not gender segregation. And structurally speaking, they would be 100% correct. That is not what we think of when we talk about gender segregation. But what's interesting about it is it suggests, and this whole story of Salafism's position vis-a-vis gender segregation suggests that the position on these matters is not set by a particular interpretive approach. It's not, one might begin with the fact that Salafism as a movement emerges in the 20s and 30s in Egypt, namely through Ansar Sunna and Muhammadiyya, Egypt's leading Salafi movement. But there's not a position on gender segregation until the 1970s. So if, one would say, if Salafism had a clear interpretive approach that led inexorably to a given position on gender relations, one would expect it to take less than half a century to develop. One might also note that none other than one of the leading Salafis of the second half of the 20th century, Muhammad Nasr ad-Din al-Albani, not only didn't believe that gender segregation was necessary, but took the view, based on his reading of the Hadith corpus, that the niqab is not necessary. Now, he, of course, becomes a minority voice within a broader, more conservative Salafi approach, but that's Albani's view, and he has a pretty significant degree of prominence up through the 1970s and, really beyond, through the 80s and even 90s. Now, the second point to make here is that once Salafis have taken this position, they're not inexorably wedded to it for eternity. That Egyptian Salafis, facing a set of structural conditions that differ from those of their Saudi counterparts, come up with something of a solution. And one might be tempted to dismiss that solution as not terribly intellectually serious, as being something of a euphemistic redefinition. And, one can make that critique. That's not really my interest here, though. What I'm interested in is that they do shift. And they shift in ways that, on the one hand, are not intellectually particularly consistent, but really do reveal something to us of how Salafism develops as a movement and is profoundly shaped by the world around it.
Fascinating stuff. And I wonder if that opinion of Albani had anything to do with his exile in Saudi Arabia later on in his life.
So this is one theory. I think this comes up in Stefan Lacroix's wonderful book, Awakening Islam. Al-Albani, it's essentially hard to know. Our sources on this are not great. Al-Albani also had a reputation as being someone who may have not been the easiest to get along with. And so it's really hard to disentangle all these threads. What we can say, without a sliver of a doubt, is that Albani took a position that put him in a distinct minority in Saudi Arabia in the 60s, and more broadly in Salafi circles from the 70s on, once gender segregation was really a non-negotiable principle. And he was taking the position not only that gender segregation wasn't necessary, but that niqab wasn't even necessary.
Which understandably caused some type of furor in the kingdom.
Yes.
Now, I'd like to move on to the second of the two performative examples that you focus in on in your book, and that is Isbal, or allowing the garments to flow past the ankles.
So Isbal, this was in some sense the hardest chapter of this book to write. And
okay, please go ahead.
In some respects, this was the hardest chapter of the book to write. And the reason for that is that it was the practice that developed latest. That if one looks at Salafi periodicals from the mid-20th century, and here I was focused on Egyptian periodicals, but also elsewhere, Isbal is not something anyone's talking about. Indeed, to the extent that I found references, the use of the masdar Isbal it was referring to Isbal al-lihya, the growing out of the beard, of letting the beard hang down. It was not referring to the Isbal of the lower garments. And if one looks at leading Islamic reformers from this period, people like Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani or Muhammad Abdu or Rashid Rida, it doesn't appear that any of them were observing Isbal. And so the first real evidence I have of Isbal emerging as a non-negotiable practice, or the observance of the prohibition of against Isbal emerging as a non-negotiable practice, is in the 70s. And one sees this in Egypt, one sees it in Saudi Arabia, and in Yemen as well. And the question is, well, what do we make of this? Again, the approach to Salafism as being a clear interpretive method that derives everything from the Quran and Sunna, so in some sense, it's not hard to figure out what comes out of this method, clearly doesn't help us here, because this takes even longer to develop than gender segregation. Though, on the other hand, it's a much more textually based obligation, simply one that has fallen off. Not unlike the obligation to pray in shoes, which is also something that Salafis revive. And so what's striking about the reinvigoration of the obligation to observe the prohibition against Isbal is what it does for Salafis in a broader social context. And the challenge for Salafis, and this is the challenge for any social movement, is that if you don't have access to the levers of power, you have to find a way to use your body to shape society. You have to organize not merely institutionally, which invariably is vulnerable to repression by an authoritarian state, but you also have to find ways to shape society through the individual practice of believers. And what Isbal does is twofold. One is it communicates authenticity. It says we look different. We're going to wear the galabiyya, and have the galabiyya cut short to distinguish ourselves as pious Muslims. But it also distinguishes Salafis from other Islamic activists. That this is not simply a battle between Islamic movements and their secular counterparts, but also among Islamic movements. And here in particular, there is the challenge posed in Egypt by the Islamic student movement, the Jama'ah Islamiyya. Now, some of the folks who participate in the Islamic student movement in the 70s end up as members of the Brotherhood, others end up as Salafis. What is clear in the 70s, though, is that they constitute a clear visual claim to authenticity, that they have their long beards, that they have their galabiyas, that they're going around Egyptian campuses, particularly in Upper Egypt, commanding right and forbidding wrong in coercive and highly disruptive fashion, and that the Salafi majority in Egypt, which is quietist, which is not engaged in politics or social disruption in any coercive sense, needs to find a way to distinguish itself. This issue only becomes more pressing in the 80s when some members of the Jama'ah Islamiyya end up engaging in armed violence against both state and civilian targets in Egypt. And so then Salafis have the problem, quietist Salafis have the problem of being confused by the security forces with activists of the violent Jama'ah Islamiyya and attempting to essentially distinguish themselves through social practices. Because by all accounts, we don't have any evidence that the Jama'ah Islamiyya adhered to the prohibition against Isbal. One looks at images of their activism from the late 70s, early 80s, and the robes aren't cut short. Now, to get to a question about visibility and ethics and where this concern with visibility comes from, to start off with, what does it mean to model oneself after the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, right? That this is the basic ethical goal. not only for Salafis, but especially for Salafis, that there is this effort to reorient one's life in a way that makes the prophetic model front and center to everything that one does. But the practices that are performed, even if one has evidence that Muhammad engaged in those practices, are not necessarily the same. And the reason for that is not the superficial form of the practices, which Salafis, to their credit, work very hard to do as precisely as possible, but rather because the logic behind them has changed. And here we have to go back to late 19th century Egypt, where on the heels of Ottoman Egyptian rule, which increasingly standardizes dress within state institutions, that you have uniforms within state institutions, one also has a model of what Tim Mitchell, the historian of Egypt, has quoted as being the politics of the self, a siasa dhatiya, of basically a self-regulating individual for whom self-regulation is not merely a moral project, but it's a vital public project, that what you do publicly is a statement of where you stand morally, ethically. And therefore, what people look like really matters, because their visible appearance signals an approach, it signals a broader set of allegiances, whether institutional or ideological. And here we see in the interwar period in Egypt, the fight between various paramilitary groups. We have the green shirts, blue shirts, and so forth, where the color of one's clothing really matters, right? Because it tells you, oh, this person belongs to X group. Now, why am I going back to late 19th century Egypt to explain Isbal? Well, because the logic is the same here. The idea is that the prohibition against letting one's robe hang down exists because it communicates someone's fidelity to the Quran and the Sunnah. That if one doesn't do this, one is similarly making a statement that for Salafis, one doesn't really find the Quran and Sunnah to be binding. And this is actually most interesting in terms of how Salafis render the legal debate over the question of what happens when someone does Isbal accidentally, or they do it in a manner that is not arrogant. That the issue with Isbal in its basic sense is that it communicates arrogance or ostentatiousness. But what, the scenario is, what if someone does it, but it either is just that one's robe falls down accidentally, or one does it but without a trace of arrogance, the most modest person in the world who just wears their robes to their ankles, that does not stop it at the shin. What does one make of that? And the Islamic legal tradition is pretty clear on this, that at the most, we're talking about an action that's makruh here, that's disfavored. It's not forbidden, and there are a variety of explanations one can come up with for why this might have happened. Whereas for Salafis, this is non-negotiable. Now, that full stop, if someone engages in letting their robes hang down, then they will be in hellfire. Because this is a rejection of God's authority over them. This is a rejection of Tawheed. That there are real theological and legal stakes for social practice. And instead of seeing that kind of theological and legal interpretation as simply being a more extreme version of Islamic law historically, one can acknowledge it as being a more uncompromising version, but the question is where that comes from, where that uncompromising black and white nature comes from. And my argument is that it is fundamentally about the linkage between ethics and visibility that is characteristic of subject formation in 19th and 20th century Egypt, and it's something that Salafis share with their ideological adversaries. That secular nationalists are concerned in the same way Salafis are, in the same way Islamists are, about what they look like and the relationship between visibility and their ethical visions. And the reason for that is not simply that these groups influence one another, though of course they do, but that they are all functioning within the basic same structure of a modern Egyptian state that offers particular models of subject formation and self-regulation that assume this linkage between ethics and visibility.
The otherwise perhaps, undecipherable connection between far-right fascist elements and, Salafist or Islamist groups in terms of how they performatively represent themselves in society. I was definitely helped along in that intellectual journey by a book by Pankaj Mishra named Age of Anger, where he kind of explores the intellectual linkages between Islamist thinkers and far-right ideologues in Europe. Now, what's interesting, to bring it back to your point about these examples, is, and I want you to kind of just explore how what you've just explored and what you've talked about there is it can be applied to the Taliban. In your book, you mentioned how the Taliban's absence of territory, because the Taliban had a lack of territory and were not in power until quite recently, the body became the landscape onto which Taliban's power was etched.
Yeah, I think, and I think this absolutely is a concern for modern Islamic movements. And the Taliban, of course, are not Salafis. They have these somewhat awkward they've had this somewhat awkward cooperation with Salafi jihadis. But I would say awkward in the sense of theologically and legally, the two do not see eye to eye in any shape or form. But fundamentally, especially when one doesn't have access to the levers of power, but even when one does and is seeking to regulate society, people's bodies are a key site of regulation. That this is a really powerful form of shaping society. And sometimes one does it through really explicit forms. And you mentioned the Islamic Republic in Iran earlier in this talk. And here we can think of compulsory veiling in the context of both post-1979 Iran as well as in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. One way is to do it through bodies in a very explicit sense. Another is to do it through institutions in a more diffuse sense, that one teaches certain ways of conducting oneself, of what adab, of proper comportment looks like, how one engages in adab, how one preserves a level of adab, both physically and in terms of speech. And so in some sense, this is part of what, to my mind, is one of the real merits of recent scholarship on modern Islam and Islamic movements, that it thinks really critically about how bodily practice is central to ideological contestation. And in this respect, it really benefits from scholarship on nationalism, which for a significant period of time has emphasized the importance of bodily practice and regulating bodily practice. Because for a long time, when we talked about Islamic movements, we were talking about their views of politics, their aspiration to control states, and so forth. And the problem with this focus is twofold. One is that even for those Islamic movements that come to power in the form of a state, such as the Taliban or the Islamic Republic of Iran, that's not all they do. And also that many Islamic movements, most notably the Muslim Brotherhood, have spent the vast majority of their histories without access to state power. So we have to understand how they're functioning, not merely as a state, but as a movement. And I think in many respects, the social movement aspect of Islamic movements is far more significant than anything they've achieved as states. Though I will say there's a really crucial point here, which is that when Islamic movements achieve power on a state level, when they shape society on a grassroots level, they are shaped by the contexts from which they emerge. Now, that might seem like an obvious point, and in some respects it is, but it's important to simply say it because these groups put tremendous effort into making the argument that though they may emerge in a given society, They are distinct from it. Now, both of those statements can be true, but the point is that Islamist practices of distinction and Islamist claims to distinction through, say, practices of tarbiyya, or for that matter, through visions of an Islamic state, Salafi social practices, yes, they offer an ideological alternative. There's no doubt about that. But ultimately, what they are claiming is A, a reaction to the world in which they emerged, and B, reflects some of the guiding logics of the world in which they emerged. And so here, to think back to an article from about 20 years ago by Nathan Brown, he makes the argument that in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood only starts really thinking seriously about what an Islamic state looks like when they're in the 50s and 60s, when they're faced with what for them is really the terrifying power of Abdel Nasser's secular nationalist regime. That what's significant about Abdel Nasser's secular nationalism for the Brotherhood isn't merely its coercive nature, though, as thousands of them are thrown into jail, they are obviously very much affected by that coercive nature, by that authoritarianism, but also by the way that it uses institutions to shape society, the way it uses the public educational system to shape society. And so they are, as a result, both distinct from their ideological opponents, but also invariably and in ways that can be missed, but are really important not to miss, deeply linked in the logics they use to exactly the things that they're and the people that they're contrasting themselves to. That, just as none of us can escape being our parents' children, whether for better or for worse, whether we seek to emulate them or to contrast ourselves or somewhere in between, one can't escape what one is reacting to. And so that's important to keep in mind for Islamic movements and states as well.
In your book, you mentioned how there was the rise of the Effendiyya, and there was a specific context in, we move on to the interwar period in the 20s. So if you could tell us a bit about the rise of the Effendiyya and its link to the Salafiyya and the Effendiyya vision of social change.
So, okay. So the Effendiyya, so the rise of the Effendiyya. All right. So the Effendiyya are in some sense the category par excellence of the state modernization project. They are, deeply committed to blending between authenticity, Salah, and modernity. They distinguish themselves not merely by pursuing particular educational or professional paths, namely modern education, employment in the state bureaucracy, but also in dressing a certain way, the shaved beard and a mustache. They wear the tarbush, the red cyclical cone hat. They often wear suits. In order to be an Effendi, one has to be seen as an Effendi. Now, Salafism and the project of the Effendiyya are in some respects ideologically about as far apart as one could get, because Salafis take the view that modernity is a project to be rejected, whereas the Effendiyya say, no, we fuse authenticity and modernity and believe that modernity as a project that arrives in Egypt in the context of British colonialism is a social good, an intellectual good. But to come back to this point about the linkage between ethics and visibility, they're both concerned with precisely this question. And the streets movements, as well as, for that matter, a variety of scouting troops, the Boy Scouts in Egypt, they all emerge out of the Effendiyya. Now, a real distinction between the Effendiyya and Salafism during this period is that Salafis, by and large, are not part of this particular cultural formation. So they're living in Egypt during the same time, but they're much more likely to have studied at Azhar. They're less likely to have, say, studied at Dar al-Ulum, the teacher preparatory school from which many Effendiyya emerged, including Effendiyya who ended up being very prominent leaders of the Islamist movement, such as Hassan al-Banna or Said Qutb. But the thing that unites them is they are seeking to shape society. They are seeking to do so not merely through political mobilization or through intellectual production, but through their daily social practices. And in that sense, the fact that the Effendis dress in one way and the Salafis dress in others, that makes perfect sense. The reason they are competing for the same thing is because they are both reacting to the project of modernization in Egypt, to a particular model of a self-regulating citizen who links ethics and visibility. And in some respects, right, because Salafi social practice emerges relatively late, we could say that the Salafis are reacting to the Effendis claiming particular social practices as being distinct. Now, that relates not just to the secular nationalist Effendis, but also to Effendis who join the Brotherhood, such as al-Banna and Qutb. And in that context, they're faced with a challenge. If the Effendis are distinguishing themselves, then how can the Salafis distinguish themselves? And their challenge, and one of the big shifts for Islamic movements, and this includes Effendi-infused Islamic movements such as the Brotherhood, is that in the pre-1952 period, we've got a pretty straightforward contrast. You have a British Christian colonial occupier and a majority Muslim indigenous population. Now, what changes post-1952 with the rise of Muhammad Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser is that the challenge and competition among Muslims becomes impossible to ignore. That for Salafis, they need to distinguish themselves not just from the foreign British occupier, but also to distinguish themselves from other Muslims, not just secular Muslims, but also Muslims who themselves are seeking to lay claim to a mantle of piety. And in that context, social practices become not just a clever move to shape society, but actually a really urgent necessity, because otherwise you're essentially leaving these cultural battlegrounds to your ideological opponents.
And fascinating context and wonderfully brought together. You've tied so many threads together that, you know, when I was reading your book, I thought it would be a daunting task as an interviewer to try and tease out the points that you've made, but you've managed to do so in such a succinct form. So I really appreciate you taking the time today, Dr. Roxinger.
My pleasure.